and people can hear me. Hi, I'm Brook Schofield. Sorry I can't be there in person. I don't have an excuse like AFTAB that it's due to health reasons, due to my bank balance. I'd love to get to Timor-Leste, but I think because of Australia's participation in your gas exploration industry, it's expensive to get to Timor-Leste from Australia, because I think we only seem to ship gas workers in and out. So I used to work on this EDUROAM project when I was based in Europe, and I continue to be affiliated with the EDUROAM activities in the Asia Pacific. And so I'm going to tell you why I think it's important for Timor-Leste now. And so EDUROAM has a long and storied history, and it's a secure wireless service for research and education. And so if you're not from a university, or you're not from a college or a high school, you might think maybe this is of no interest to me. But I will explain that if you're from ISPs, if you're from government, if you're from other sectors, then EDUROAM and its parallel services are actually interesting and useful for you to explore. And so the first is, where is it? So this is not just a provincial service or a service just for Timor-Leste. This is a global service that's been rolled out by research and educational institutions and NRENs, other forms of academia, industrial science, and medical organizations around the planet. And so, we've continued to have a growth in this service. More than 110 territories around the planet currently have EDUROAM. And so if you look, it's heavily dominated by work in Europe, less so in Africa and Latin America, and increasingly in Asia. But we still have a very big way to go. And so we have roaming operators in Asia Pac. That seems to be a message saying you can watch it on YouTube Live. So we have a lot of production deployments that you can see from this map. And actually, if you can see the bottom of Australia, there's a tiny little triangle island, and that is the island that I live on. So although, Timor-Leste is an island nation, Tasmania is an island state of Australia, and that's where I'm based. And so we have some production deployments, and you can see there's quite a lot of, I guess some large countries have deployed it. Because they're large, it looks dominant on the map, on a global map, or in this case, on this regional map. But still, we need a lot of depth in the deployment. We need to continue to get more and more organizations, libraries, archives, zoological gardens, and public spaces also connected to EDUROAM, in addition to just the research and educational institutions. There's some pilots going on in Cambodia, Bhutan, Afghanistan. And you'll see pending, right? Still don't have anything happening in Timor-Leste, in Papua New Guinea, Myanmar, Vietnam, Mongolia, and most of the Pacific is without EDUROAM at this point in time. And so the base of participation is actually still quite huge, right? There's only 24 NRENs that are active in the Asia Pac region, even though there's many more, economies. There's 56 APNIC members economies throughout the region. And then if you go to the United Nations list, they say that there are 73 countries in Asia Pacific. It always depends on how you cut up countries, because obviously APNIC has overlap between the other regional internet registries on membership in the region, because some of Asia is covered by the RIPE NCC, particularly the Middle East, and ARAN has some of the Pacific. And I actually think that even AFRINIC and APNIC swap some organizations in the Indian Ocean, for instance. And so you can see that we have 29 economies in Oceania. The value in brackets are the number of educational institutions that I can find in those. So out of the landlocked countries, small island developing nations, developing states, and developing and concession countries, there's still quite a lot of institutions that exist in those locations that don't have access to EDUROAM. So what is it? You say, where is it? But what is it? So it's a global wireless roaming service. It's based on WPA2 Enterprise. It uses radius to transport your connections, your credentials, and it has this trust fabric that's based on radius as well as policy, so a radius hierarchy. It doesn't use web splash screens or shared passwords, as you may be more commonly used for Wi-Fi. It started in TF Mobility, a task force of Terrainer that I used to be involved in. And EDUROAM stands for Education Roaming. And importantly, it's free for roaming users. So there's no need to reconcile costs between institutions for users. And so this is obviously a benefit, particularly for the universities and their students, but there's a cost burden associated with that. And so that can be contentious for some, for some instances. When it was being developed, they looked at a few options. One of them was to have open Wi-Fi, just because connecting to Wi-Fi itself was even problematic once upon a time. And then because there was a cost to traffic, people wanted to use virtual private networks to route back to your home institution, so they would pick up the bill for that link. Now, that only works if you have an internet exchange point, because if your traffic is going out to the commodity internet and coming back in via a different provider in order to replicate usage of a user, that's going to, in effect, double the cost. It's going to have an inbound connection cost as well as an outbound cost. So, because of the structure of the network in Timor-Leste, and also the structure of networks back then, that became problematic to sort of work at scale. The next one was this web redirect and captive portals. They're popular in airports and cafes and hotels, increasingly becoming less popular because there's no over-the-air security, and you're not sure whether you can trust them. So once, this is an old screenshot, but it's from Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And you get this pop-up of connecting to the Wi-Fi and options to pay for it. And you don't actually know when you enter this Wi-Fi network whether this is legit or is this run by a 16-year-old on her laptop as a site to scam your credit card details, right? Because you're not connected to the real internet at this point in time, so you can't work out whether it's actually a working network or not, and it's hard to trust until you're connected to the internet. And so both AFTAB and AWAL talked about DNSSEC and other things. When you're not connected to the real internet, and you can't verify all of this information, you actually don't know, the profile of the network that you're connected to. And so, as time has changed, so has technology. So, if you look at this graph over time, you can see unencrypted open Wi-Fi networks have really plummeted over time. That's far less common. WPA2 has increased. WPA1 has disappeared. WPA3 is starting to rise, a very small percentage. And increasingly, the networks that exist out there are encrypted. Now, if you don't know the password, you can't connect to them. And so that's one of the problems that EDUROAM tries to solve. So how does it work? This is what it looks like. Got some old graphics here. If you're a user that's visited an institution, you'll connect to a Wi-Fi access point that will connect you to the radius server of the institution. You don't belong to that institution because you're a visitor, so it will send the request upstream to the roaming operator. It'll find the institution that you belong to, authenticate against their user database, and send back a status saying you've authenticated correctly and you're allowed on the EDUROAM network. And then the access point will drop you onto, a visitor VLAN, for instance. Now, these are obviously all different levels of complexity that you can deploy in your situation. So if you don't have VLANs, then you just connect people to the network. But the more sophisticated your network is, and how you segregate your own users, you can also do that for visitors through EDUROAM. And so this box is what the campus is responsible for. This is the campus deployment. And so this builds on your existing Wi-Fi deployment. No new equipment, just new configuration. You don't do pre-shared keys for Wi-Fi. You don't do splash screen portals. And one of the benefits is you can use EDUROAM as your home Wi-Fi network. So if you're changing from a pre-shared key or an open Wi-Fi network with a captive portal, you can rename your network EDUROAM, and as you've moved to WPA2 Enterprise Network, you now have this whole a network that will work when people roam as well as being on campus, right? This seamless one network that will work all of the time. Equally, as you deploy EDUROAM, you can stop doing guest accounts for visitors, because they can use their EDUROAM credentials when they come and visit. So you can simplify the help desk, and then there's no cost associated with that. And also, because EDUROAM is a global service, as we make improvements and deployment worldwide, that also benefits your campus. Some of the reasons people choose not to deploy EDUROAM, or the reasons they state, is they don't like the loss of control, because you want to know who's accessing your network. And so this is not true. Everyone that visits your network is a member of an EDUROAM network, and you can ask the local EDUROAM operator. You can go upstream to the regional operators, and you can find people in particular cases if there's some need to do mitigation, contact law enforcement, all of those issues. So, one of the things is, evil people use EDUROAM. You can still monitor usage and block individuals, right? But you do have to report blocking individuals or blocking institutions upstream so that those issues can be resolved. Once upon a time, people used to say, oh, the US doesn't have EDUROAM, so why would I go there? Or Australia doesn't have EDUROAM, why would we want to deploy it? It doesn't make sense. Now, with more than 110 countries and lots of pilots with EDUROAM, that's gone away as an excuse. And so increasingly, you have the network effect with lots of people deploying EDUROAM. You have this benefit of it will be available in many locations. And I guess maybe the closest location, Charles Darwin University, has EDUROAM. Or if you go to the APNIC offices and you're going to be signing an APNIC Foundation grant, EDUROAM is available there. Some people say, my staff and students don't go anywhere, and so there's no need to have a roaming service like EDUROAM. And actually, one of the most significant projects was done by Janet in the UK. This is a map of the UK, slightly tilted because it was projected on the globe. And what they've done is they've done little blobs of usage of EDUROAM use, high volume use of EDUROAM. And you can see these different blobs. Now you see this really large red blob. If you don't know the geography of the UK, you might think that's London. And in fact, when they first built this graph, they thought it was London, and they thought the data of where the institutions were based was just wrong, and they just needed to shift the location of all of the blobs over to best suit London, because that little cluster of smaller red blobs is actually London. But when they did some more investigation, they actually worked out, no, the blobs are in the correct spot. And so why is there so much use in the southeast of England and not in London? And it was because 3 colleges decided to collaborate on courses. So you wouldn't actually do every single course at every single college, and you'd actually have to physically walk. There's about a kilometre and a half in a triangle of these 3 colleges. And so if you wanted to do advanced mathematics and physics, you would go to a different college. If you're doing arts, you would go to a different college. If you're doing drama, television production, you'd go to a different college. But you wouldn't enroll in that college. You'd stay enrolled in your own, and you just wander down the road and do particular classes. And this would create this huge amount of mobility with the students. And this was what Janet ended up coining the term permissionless innovation, right? The research network built this infrastructure. EDUROAM existed in these institutions, and the colleges didn't need permission from anyone to build, to start to collaborate and to allow their students to move around. And so this is another flight map of where people go. So you could see there's quite a lot of mobility happening around the UK, and not everyone is going to London, as sort of everyone once feared. The London institutions would take on the burden of all network traffic. It's also not just EDUROAM. So while EDUROAM is a very old service, it's more than 20 years old now. It spawned additional services, GovRoam, within the Netherlands and Belgium and the UK, where government organisations decided they wanted a similar service and they wanted mobility, and the Dutch actually convinced their tax office to do it first. And once the tax office decided it was okay and acceptable for their staff, everyone else stopped having objections. And so you've got a shared infrastructure that's paid for by the government in lots of locations. And so if you're already paying for it, it makes no sense to deny other users funded via the same resources not to have access to those networks. CityRoam is a research project out of Tohoku University in Japan, and they do a lot of EDUROAM and city roaming work to look at the interoperability of roaming. And then open roaming is a service of the Wireless Broadband Alliance. That's actually reasonably new, but it actually uses the technology that EDUROAM was built on. And so EDUROAM has, as services like Hotspot 2.0, Next Generation Hotspot, and Wi-Fi Passpoint, these were all the brand names given to sort of the precursor work that is open roaming. They basically used the exact same building blocks that were already used in EDUROAM, because EDUROAM didn't develop anything new. It just compiled the best of breed building blocks to make these things work. And so the best thing about using something like open roaming or Wireless Broadband Alliance or CityRoam hotspots is that you can, some of them are compatible with your EDUROAM service, and you'll just connect without having to do anything special. And so actually there's nothing simpler than doing nothing, right? You just want to connect to that hotspot. You don't want to have to reconfigure your phone or your laptop or your tablet. You just want it to work. And this has created the opportunity for public-private partnerships. And so I think there's a few instances of this, and I don't know if there are any mobile operators in the meeting at the moment, but certainly in Ireland, the Irish NREN actually collaborated with EDUROAM and the second most popular mobile phone provider, because the second most popular provider wants to be the most popular at some point in time. And so they provided discounts for students, and those students were connected to EDUROAM as well as to buying a mobile, cellular data plan from the provider. Because their devices had EDUROAM, whenever they were at a university campus or at a cafe run by the ISP, the cellular operator, they would get dropped onto EDUROAM, which is a much cheaper network for the operator to deal with rather than cellular. They wanted to sell cellular at the time to their business customers that are more expensive, but they also wanted to establish a user base. So students are always price conscious. If someone's willing to give them a discount, then they'll follow that. And so that was actually very, very effective for HEN in Ireland to broaden the deployment of EDUROAM, because the operator was willing to put it into cafes and those sorts of organizations that they managed a hotspot for. but it also increased the user base because you need new people to fund the development of your mobile infrastructure. And so we had students are, once they get rich enough, and I guess equally, people are getting younger and younger, getting mobile phones. I know there's a debate in Australia of whether we want to try and keep mobile phones out of kids' hands for longer, but that seems to be failing. And so, nearly everyone seems to have a mobile phone these days. And in Sweden, they partnered with an organization called the Cloud, and the NREN is rich enough there that they actually pay a commercial operator to let their students use hotspots that are run by this company. So how do we get it? You first start with a pilot deployment. Now, EDUROAM is never an island. EDUROAM is always interconnected. So I don't want you to rush back to your campus and change your SSID to EDUROAM and decide job done, because it always needs to link. It always needs to work, because you'll have instances where there'll be people from the Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand that have EDUROAM accounts that will actually want to connect, or their devices will attempt to connect. And so when I connected up Chile, the Reuna, they wanted to know if I'd handed out test accounts to people in their country when they first did deployment, because when they did the deployment at their national university, they actually had some people from the University of Queensland on campus doing a research project, and their devices started to connect. So the first users to connect in Chile weren't people from Chile itself. They were actually Australians that happened to be there working on a research project, and their phones just noticed EDUROAM was around, tried to connect, and it worked. And they were surprised by this. But this is why EDUROAM always has to be interconnected. We always want a working service, even when it's a pilot deployment. So the steps are connect to upstream radius servers, do some deployments, and get some knowledge of how it works. And then you can go through the process of becoming a production deployment, which requires the signing of some paperwork, more a resilient regional proxy server deployment, going through and doing the trademark registration, and then you get access to a range of additional services that make your deployment even simpler. And so this is the operator, the operator infrastructure. You need to run a central radius server. The campus infrastructure is hotspots, Wi-Fi access points, a local radius server, and a user database. And then this is because you have a lot of choices for authentication options with your user database. And sometimes this can be a little bit overwhelming. And so that's why you need to make choices, obviously, because you'll have particular identity storage or not for your campus. And you'll have a range of devices that your student and staff base use. And so we've actually developed a tool called CAT, Configuration Assistant Tool, which actually comes with customized installers and profiles for a large range of devices, an increasing range of devices. This is actually an old screenshot. And some things have simplified over time as operating systems have been discontinued or improvements have been made. If you're just a cafe, then you can just do hotspot infrastructure. You don't actually have to do everything else. And you can do cloud-based infrastructure. So maybe there's a need in Timor-Leste to concentrate on some cloud deployment services that people can use to more rapidly increase the deployment. Governance requires, or growth requires governance. And so we actually, in 2011, so more than a decade after EDUROAM started, we needed to, it was heavily European influenced, and we needed to give wider representation. And so we created this Global EDUROAM Governance Committee, which created the compliance statement. I was the founding secretary of that group when it started, and we have some Asia Pac representatives on that. It used to be Warwick Mitchell, if people know Warwick, from ARNet in Australia. He's recently stepped away from that role and been replaced with Paul He. And I don't have a picture of Paul. I've asked him for it. He hasn't sent me one. But Hideaki Goto, who from Tokyo University and EDUROAM, is one of your reps, and Doc Choi from Korea. So what's next after EDUROAM? Right, it's the federation. The other projects that I work on are Identity Federation. So EDUROAM allows you to access Wi-Fi when you physically move, and Identity Federation allows you to access services, via your web browser using your university or institutional account. And so there's a service called EdgeGain, which is a global authentication infrastructure. As you can see, this is an old map. So it shows the various progress of people deploying around the globe. And it very similarly maps to EDUROAM deployment. And hopefully, what's next for EDUROAM is that we get Timor-Leste on the map, and we get a deployment, a pilot started, and some interest from people there. So if you have questions, contact me or ask them now, and I'll stop sharing, and hopefully I'll be able to read any comments in the chat.